I'd like to acknowledge Australia's First Nation people as the traditional custodians of the land, and for this episode in particular, the Noongar people. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging.
The wines have this incredible ability to show generosity and power, yet be pulled back in with this incredible fine line, and acid really tightens up the palate and gives the wines incredible energy. And I think that's a beautiful combination when you think about, great wines of the world.
This is Over a Glass. I'm Shanteh Wale. Frankland Estate is a family affair. Located in the remote Great Southern of Western Australia, their little slice of grape-growing heaven is called the Frankland River region. Here, the self-sufficient, pioneering family have established themselves as one of Australia's most exciting wine estates. And today, I have the pleasure of speaking to Hunter Smith. Hi, Hunter. Thanks for joining me.
Hi, Shanteh. Thank you. The pleasure's mine.
Oh, well, I'm so glad that we got you. Hunter, we have around about 4,000 kilometres stretched between where you and I are today. Just for all our listeners, can you tell us what are you looking out on today? Where are you joining us from?
So I'm actually sitting on a veranda, and which has a beautiful view to the northeast and down across the hillside. And Frankland River's probably famous for its rich farming land, high rainfall farming land, but obviously in the late 50s, early 60s, vineyards started popping up. And so I'm looking down over our Isolation Ridge vineyard that surrounds the winery itself. And there's fog down in the valleys, and, the vines are starting to lose their leaves, and as we head towards pruning. So very picturesque, cool morning.
Oh, sounds idyllic to me. I want to talk a bit about the Frankland Estate, how Frankland Estate came about, and then we'll get to kind of your part in it. So can you give us a little background, because it is such an important estate and you've got so many fans. So we want to hear all about where this wonderful idea came about.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting one. My father was, he grew up on a vineyard in the Riverland of South Australia, and, in his late teenage years, that was his playground, I suppose, water skiing, on the Murray and hanging out in South Australia. And so wine was very much part of, or grape growing was very much part of his growing up. And, wine drinking became very much a part of his hobby, I suppose. And his family left the Riverland and came to Western Australia, and my grandfather settled on a war service settlement place down in Frankland River, or just down the road, actually, Rocky Gully to be exact. But we're only talking 15 kilometres there. But he was selling real estate in Perth, and my mother was doing radiology in Perth, and they met, and they would do these weekend trips to my grandfather's, my father's farm down in Rocky Gully, and they saw a property for sale on one of these trips and decided that they should look at buying it, and with the aim of potentially moving down and farming, and I'm talking back then it was all mostly sheep grazing, fine wool, merino wool production, which we still do a little bit of, but that's a different story. And they fell in love with the property, and wool was going through some good times, and they purchased another property across the road, and then finally the third property, which was just a little further, 4 kilometres up on top of the hill, which is where we now are, where I'm now sitting today, and where the Isolation Ridge vineyard is. So we're talking in the about 1974. My father and mother bought this property, and for many years it was sheep grazing, wheat canola production, and then in 1988, after, I suppose, my parents still having this passion for drinking wine and, all things wine. They'd spent a number of years going backwards and forwards to Europe, and particularly Bordeaux, immersing themselves and actually doing vintages in Bordeaux, and then really as a hobby. And then my father started doing a few vintages with local producers like Plantagenet Wines, which were newly established at the time, and they made the decision in 1988 to plant a small vineyard. So originally that was not quite a hectare of Riesling, a hectare of Chardonnay, 2 hectares of Shiraz, 2 hectares of Cabernet Sauvignon, and a hectare of Cabernet Franc, and that was the original plantings in '88. And so that was, really the start of it. I don't think they really knew what they were getting themselves into, and I think the big thing here is that there was a couple of vineyards in the area, but really in the Great Southern back in 1988, wine growing was not the norm in the region, and so they had to overcome all these challenges around starting a winery. The concrete was poured in the middle of the Isolation Ridge vineyard in 1992, ready for the 93 harvest. So, all these things all these challenges around producing wine in a very remote location became very real very quickly for them. But, it was, speaking to them, they wouldn't change a moment of that. But one of the things I would say, I think really has stayed true to our business and to our philosophy around wine is, their exposure to, and their willingness to travel and be exposed to such great wineries and estates around the world, throughout Europe particularly, in the early 80s in particular. They really felt a passion for these wineries that were focused on making wines that expressed a true sense of place. And I think that's something that's very much held true to us all the way through the journey. And one of the things that drives us around making the wines in the location we make them.
Yeah, I mean, they went straight to Bordeaux. I mean, fantastic decision, I suppose, to really see and immerse themselves in winemaking. But Harold Olmo was a big part of, had a big impact on viticulture in the region, and, saw the potential of some of those kind of Bordeaux varieties there. What has been your, experience for the region with Harold Olmo? It's I just think it's a bit of a nice story, and haven't had anyone tell it yet. So
yeah, well, I mean, it was interesting. Harold Olmo was sort of becoming more and more regarded through that, through the 50s with his his big claim to fame was really coming up with a clone of Chardonnay that, made the Napa Valley produce consistently good yielding Chardonnay that really put Napa Valley as a core producing region of California. And so that industry obviously went from strength to strength, and as did his reputation around the world. And, I think later was dubbed the Indiana Jones of viticulture, and travelled, to extraordinary places to look at varietals and clones of grapes from all over the world. But thankfully for Western Australia, he was invited by the Agricultural Society back in 1955 to come to Western Australia and help the Swan Valley with some issues they were having with their grape growing, and that was, reduced vine vigour and a few things. And he quickly pointed out that there was a nematode issue in the soils, and that, with some cultivation and some good viticultural practices, they would remedy those. But he did say to the government at the time, well, you should look at cooler climates for good good grape production to make fine table wines. So really, so they asked him to stay on in the state and spend more time, and he travelled down through the southwest, and I suppose was the first person to put a flag in the ground in the upper reaches of the Frankland River, which in his little publication he put out in 1956 says that, the upper reaches of the Frankland River region would be the ideal location based on soil types, rainfall, climatic data, and, drew a connection to that of Bordeaux. And I think now with so that was really the first acknowledgement of, how successful this region might be. And it was just further down the road in Mount Barker that a year or so later, the first sort of commercial vineyard was planted. Being a couple of years before the Margaret River, in fact. So, it's a nice little story there of his early acknowledgement of how good the region was. And when my parents started researching, if there was merit in planting a vineyard at Frankland Estate, they quickly came across his recommendations from the, State Library, where his little booklet is today. So, yeah, look, it's a nice little story, and I think one that many of the growers in Frankland River and in fact ourselves are very grateful for.
Definitely, especially for that foresight and for, being the first one to stick your neck out and say so. And you've obviously paid homage to that with your Olmo's Reward, one of my favourite wines of yours. But let's talk a little bit about where you got involved. Like we said, Frankland Estate is a family affair. But when did you decide that, wine was going to be the path for you and that you wanted to continue on and see that legacy forward? Yeah,
I mean, it sort of came quite late to me in a way, in that, when you grow up in a vineyard and your parents are saying, come on, let's go at 6 o'clock on a winter's morning and it's, 4 degrees outside, and they're encouraging you to, get out there and prune grapevines. I always thought to myself, God, there's got to be something better to do with one's life. And my parents were very encouraging. I mean, Frankland River is an extraordinarily remote place in anyone's language, and they were very encouraging to get out there and see the rest of Australia, and in fact the rest of the world. And so, it wasn't on my radar really that this was an opportunity or, something to just necessarily go back to or be involved with. So although I love the land, we grew up in an amazing place, and, as young children, I'd ride, we'd have our horses and I'd ride our horses with my rabbit traps hanging off the saddle, and, we'd do a little lap and catch rabbits and, do all these sort of very rural things that I think have, when I look back, and it really entrenched me into really loving where we are, what Frankland River is and what the region is, this, core roots back to the land. And I think, having such a great experience growing up as a child, in this location, inevitably has brought me back here and wanting my children to experience that same thing. But fundamentally, I left school thinking I would become an architect, and did fine arts for a year and got a little bit despondent with that, I suppose, and not knowing what to do, headed off working on broadacre farms in central New South Wales and then southern New South Wales, and ended up going to business school down in Victoria and spent 3 years doing that, and worked briefly for 12 months at Rabobank in an office in Melbourne, and loved it. I actually really enjoyed that, and I thought there's a future here for me. And before I got stuck into that, I thought I'd go travelling overseas, in which I hadn't been overseas at the time, and promptly ran out of money. And the only thing I really knew how to do and wanted to do, I didn't want, a lot of my mates were, pouring beer at a bar or making cocktails. I was sort of more keen to stay outdoors. And so I found myself a job with a good friend of the family's, Eric Salomon, in the Kremstal of Austria. And working in his winery for vintage, and it was really simply a means to an end to fund onward travels, but quickly got immersed in what he was doing, and certainly seeing his incredible passion for his craft and making such a great success of quite a small industry, a small business really, which was not the norm in Australia in the late 80s. People quickly grew into quite big production facilities, and, businesses got bigger and bigger. And I really thought, wow, this is, this guy's running an incredible business, but he's also so incredibly passionate about it. And, would come to the winery and he'd look, very tired, and I'd say, "You're right, Eric." And he'd say, "Oh, I think there's rain coming, and, I can feel it," and all these sort of things. And you'd like, he clearly hasn't slept well. But in fact, 2 or 3 days later, the rain would come, and I honestly believe he could feel it. He just incredibly connected to his vineyards, into his surroundings, and what he was doing with his life. And that had an enormous impact on me, I must say, and was really probably the turning point of saying, gosh, this is something I'd like to be involved with for the rest of my life. And so that's how it sort of came about. And from there, I went down to Germany and worked briefly for Bernard Breuer, on the edge of the Rheingau, and travelled extensively visiting producers through Germany and down through the south of France, and spending doing a few more vintages, and the rest sort of fell into place. And I returned back to Frankland in 2000, and my sister Elizabeth, who I now share the business with, she'd already just returned home, and like me, her passion was to be involved with the wine industry as well. So we both sort of landed back in the wine business, and probably, initially I thought I'll just help with vintage and then look for a job in the Australian industry somewhere, and probably just saw the opportunity and how great, the landscape was for fine wine production in Frankland River, and thought, wow, gee. And we quickly, sourced them. We found a couple of very small rundown vineyards of Riesling vineyards, and, Eric sort of really did show me at Salomon, how unique little vineyards can throw such a strong sense of place, and have this transparency of the soil, and I think he made at the time about 14 different single vineyard wines, and I thought, this is ridiculous when I first went in there, and then came out fully converted that that in fact was the thing. And so look, we found a couple of little vineyard sites around Frankland, and they were small. One was 1.5 hectares, another was 3 hectares, Poison Hill Vineyard, which we still do today, and pruned them and got them back into production, and saw quite quickly how prominent they can express their own unique characteristics, and I suppose that in itself led to further thinking, how do we make that expression of sight even more true, and you know, ongoing travels around the world, and in fact my experience with Salomon and other German growers and south of France, you know, all these guys even back then talked a lot about organics, and we started seriously thinking about organic wine production. And so 2006, probably the wettest year in the history of Frankland River, we decided to take on organics, and probably very naively initially, but look, in fact, it wasn't long before we were fully on board with it and thinking this was, and I still say today, I think, you know, the decision to become organic and fully certified organic has been one of the best decisions that our business has made in the history of its business, you know, of our business. So, you know, all these things sort of slowly evolved, and yeah, today, I mean, my sister Elizabeth and her husband Brian Kent, he joined us in 2010, and so today we're, you know, the three of us are a very tight knit, you know, very focused, very determined trio that, our days are all encompassed by wine. So
that's not a bad thing to bring people together.
No,
just
exactly.
For people listening as well, talking about your parents, Barry Smith and Judy Callum, where we get the Smith Callum from. And then, like you said, you've got yourself and your sister Elizabeth and her husband who are taking care of the kind of viticulture and kind of side of things. I've got a blended family and we're very close. And a lot of people find it quite bizarre. But I think that when it works, it can work. And like you said, when you've all got wine as the kind of, you know, the core that brings you together, I can see how it can completely work. But you all live on site, is that correct?
Yeah, well, we're separated probably by 4 or 5 kilometres, you know, either way. I mean, I live just behind the vineyard, and then Elizabeth and Brian are, you know, up the road a bit and across the road on their property, and then my parents are 4.5 kilometres down the road on their original property. So we have our, you know, we do have our space, but no, you know, look, I think the reality is we've just been so bloody determined to make this all work, and know how, you know, having travelled, I think, you know, we say, I think we added it up over a magnum of wine one night that, you know, combined we bring together about 160 vintages of experience, and we all sit around the kitchen table or the boardroom table, as we call our rustic table in one of our offices. But, you know, it's an incredible amount of knowledge from experience gathered from all over the world, and I think with that we've been able to really ask ourselves the hard questions. You know, what do our wine, you know, what is unique about our wines? What do we want our wine story to be about? And, you know, vineyard site is the one thing that no one else can replicate. And beyond that, I think, you know, true immersion in the vineyard site. You know, we don't have, you know, it's 4 hours to our local, you know, nightclub, or you know, a couple of hours to a good restaurant scene, or, you know, so when we're in Franklin, we live and breathe it. You know, we're out there. You know, we hear the rain fall on the roof every night. We hear, you know, that we feel the intensity of the sun, or the, you know, the coldness of the mornings, or, you know, all these things, and we take that, you know, we take that and work with it. You know, we adapt. Every season is different. We adapt accordingly and nurture our vines through, and take all the knowledge that we have, and I think that is what probably, that philosophy, along with our piece of dirt, is what's unique, you know, and that's what we try and put on the table, so to speak, for people to enjoy.
Yeah, I think that's been very successful. And I'll talk a little bit about your single sites a bit later as well. But there's someone that we didn't mention, and that is Gladys, another family member. Who's Gladys?
Gladys, the guinea fowl, came to prominence very early on in the piece when Judy and Barry had some help from writer, marketing friend of theirs, and said, you guys have got to tell a bit more of your story about, your, environmental credentials and what's happening in the vineyard. And for quite a while there was a blog. There was a blog on the website from Gladys who would update the world on the goings on of Frankland Estate viticultural. What was happening out in the vineyards, etc. So, that was all a bit of fun. And look, Gladys, there's a new Gladys that comes in, every so often as the generations of guinea fowls have come and gone. But we still use them very much in our, important part of pest control, I suppose, out in the vineyard. So, yeah.
Look, you could be starting the new wave of the guinea fowl, wine guinea fowl of Australia, and a new book or calendar could be published. So we'll just let everyone know it started here.
Yeah, exactly.
Talking about organic certification and also your single sites, I think that's been something incredibly strong that I've always seen from Frankland Estate, that you like you said, you always had a focus on talking about why Poison Hill was different to Isolation Ridge, and that has come across very clearly. But it doesn't surprise me that, after your experience with some of the winemakers you have, why Riesling's always been such a strong suit for you all. I happen to think that there's probably no better expression of Riesling in Australia at this time. So tell me about your experience with Riesling over the years. And I also want to touch, if you don't mind, on Shiraz or Syrah as well, if we can.
Yeah. Look, I think it was interesting. Riesling sort of evolved from, Judy and Barry planted the original vineyard a little under a hectare, and the recommendation was that don't plant too much Riesling because you'll find it hard to sell. And, this is 88, 91 was their first release. By the time they got to 93, they started to appreciate what people were saying. And my mother and father felt that it was such a shame that people didn't understand these fantastic dry Rieslings, not only of Frankland Estate and Isolation Ridge, but, globally. And so Judy set about asking some friends that they'd met on their travels, and Eric Salomon was one of those guys, but, Bernard Breuer and all the, Helmut Donhoff and, all these great producers of Riesling around the world, Ernie Luzin, et cetera. But she, wrote them a letter and asked them would they be interested in coming to Australia to showcase their beautiful Rieslings, and which, there was some sort of, I suppose, absolute interest in, but they thought, Australia, really, of all the places in the world to sell our Rieslings. And, a number of those guys came down, and Judy established the first Frankland Estate International Riesling tasting, which became a biannual event and then triannual, really showcasing these amazing Rieslings. And at the time, a lot of people just didn't have the awareness and understanding of how great these wines were. Now, today, it's a totally different story. People totally get it. These wines are totally sought after and totally sold out well before they're produced. But back then it was a bit of a novelty for these guys to travel out to Australia, and really for Judy, hats off to her. Some of these guys, I remember speaking to Philip Wittmann when he was last in Australia, and he said, it is incredible. The Australian market is our second largest export market behind America. I mean, that's phenomenal, and so so look, I think Australians really now do understand this varietal. I think there's still much more awareness still to go. It's a really exciting varietal, but on top of that, I should say that Judy and Barry also established a Riesling scholarship, and that was something back in the late 90s. Patrick Walsh, our now distributor of Cellarham wines, won for the first time, and he set off around Europe. His prize was a trip to Europe, and he set off around Europe and like Judy and Barry, fell in love with some of these people and their wines, and started importing them. And today, obviously Cellarham runs one of the great importing businesses of Australia, small boutique importing businesses of Australia, and owes a lot of that to Judy, as he says, but Judy and Barry. So, look, I mean, it's been a fantastic story, and the friendship and the camaraderie of our Riesling producers around the globe have really, I suppose, fast-tracked for Frankland Estate the knowledge and the end wines that we now produce. So that's always been a very special story for us. And then tied into that, I suppose, coming back to your question about Syrah, I mean, Syrah really has been an interesting journey for us, and one where I think the wines today are as good as they've ever been, in that we were there in the early 2000s when America was taking Australian Shiraz and a lot from Barossa and McLaren Vale and these, quite, bigger styles, powerful wines, and also some of the bigger, fruitier styles. And Frankland Estate, I've got to say, we even from Frankland River, we were thinking, well, that slightly bigger style is where it's at, and probably in the early 2000s, we thought, I'm not sure this is the Syrah or the Shiraz that we're meant to make. When we really sat back and looked at it and looked at how good this cooler climate was for, fine acid lines and beautiful balance and aromatics in Syrah, we really started to change things up. And today, the way we approach Syrah is considerably more complex than the way we considered it, 20 years ago. And, from different clones to different planting densities to different row orientations and all these things that have taken, really a good generation and a half to establish. And, today, really, we're really excited to put, a handful of Syrahs out into the market, which really encapsulate, I suppose, not only the amazing growing conditions, those dry but cool growing conditions we get in Frankland River, but just really highlighting how great the varietal can be in a totally different spectrum to what a lot of our international markets are very used to seeing from Australia.
Definitely. And I think I almost look at them almost as two completely different varieties in that we have, such great expression now of moderate, kind of slightly warmer expressions of Shiraz that I indulge in, but then also the cool climate styles that are coming out really are just so elegant and perfumed, and I almost just see them in two different ways. I appreciate both of them for very, very different reasons. But I think that, you guys in particular are really showcasing just what those southern areas can do in WA with Syrah, and it's incredibly exciting. And I think that may be something that we're going to see take off, I mean, you guys are already doing an amazing job and selling it very well, but I think we're only going to see, this is the start, I think, for for Syrah in the southern areas. But what you said, you talked a little bit about being cooler, and you have some great sunlight hours. But being so far south, you are getting some cold ocean breezes that come through. Just talk us through a little bit about the Frankland River region as a grape growing country.
Yeah, I mean, and so simply put, I suppose, we're about 64 kilometres from the Southern Ocean. And so with that, you come across from the coastline, you make your way up towards Frankland River. You've got gradual elevation, and by the time you get to Frankland Estate, you sit at around 280 metres above sea level, which is not huge, but, Western Australia fundamentally is, pretty flat. And, we joke that you can stand on a beer carton and see across the whole state. But, look, there's these... In Frankland River, you've got this beautiful valley system, and so you've got these very picturesque rolling hills that in winter are, a beautiful rich green rolling hills with, native forest. And just between us and the coast is actually one of the biggest what do you call it? Sorry, I'm having a bit of a moment, but nature reserves in the southern hemisphere. An extraordinary expanse of native forest, and I suppose that all sets the tone for these quite remote vineyard sites that sit, quite spread out amongst, beautiful rolling hills and broad acre farmland, but really punctuated by, finding these idyllic sites right on top of the hillsides, which, are all pretty much have this ironstone gravel soil, lateritic soil, and we find that it's within these ironstone lateritic soils that you get incredibly good vine health and balance. The water leaches through nicely, and nutrients stay within the soil, and the vines get up with that bit of elevation. They get this beautiful cool breeze that comes in off the Southern Ocean, and it makes its way up the river valley and cools what otherwise might be quite a warm day. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, these cool sea breezes hit the vineyard areas and cool the vines down, and you can almost see it happening in front of you on a daily basis, where they, the leaves just start to perk up a bit with those cool breezes, and then as the sun sets, we have this incredible big open blue sky that takes up, 3/4 of the landscape. And the heat just disappears, and we have these incredibly cold nights, even in the middle of summer. And so when I say incredibly cold, our daytime temperatures will be 30 degrees, and then by, 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock in the evening, we'll be back down to sort of 12, 14 degrees, and then first thing in the morning, we can be below 10 degrees Celsius. So, it's a very unique location where you get, and almost to some degree, I'd say cool climate is not really the right word for where we are, because of the region is quite dry. By December, the green grass is long gone, and we have these beautiful brown rolling hills or straw-coloured rolling hills, and all the grass sort of dies off. And I think in a way, the vines have to really get their roots down into the soil and survive this nice long dry summer. And thankfully for the cool evenings, that's their respite. And so you have this beautiful combination of, dryness but coolness, and I see that in the wines. The wines have this incredible ability to show generosity and power, yet be pulled back in with this incredible fine line and acid, this beautiful acid sort of balance that really tightens up the palate and gives the wines incredible energy. And I think that's a beautiful combination when you think about, great wines of the world.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think that there's always drive and length that just continues on with a lot of the wines from the Great Southern, and that it's that kind of keeps you paying attention to the wine throughout. So, some such beautiful examples and so much potential for quite a few different varieties down there. And like I said, I think it's only going to get more exciting. But what do you see for the future of the Great Southern regions of WA? What are you hoping to see in the next few years?
Well, I think already, we're starting to see some really good young producers, doing examples of, dare I say, the more traditional of the varietals, but also, there's plantings going on of all sorts of new things, and there's some new varietals sort of starting to emerge. I mean, at Frankland Estate, we've planted some Touriga Nacional and Grüne Veltliner, and even those two varietals said in the same sentence, people would be scratching their heads. But I do think that, this very unique sort of ability to have incredible hang time and length of season. So, it's not uncommon for our Mourvèdre, for example, and Cabernet Franc, Cabernet Sauvignon to be picked, the very last week of April or the first week of May. I mean, by then things are getting very cool, but maintain, in the good seasons, maintain the dryness, and it just allows the grapes to hang on the vine and pick up this incredible complexity and intensity of flavour, but not push into high alcohols or high sugar levels. And so it's a really lovely combination, and I think there's actually a lot of opportunity there for all sorts of varietals. And so, who knows? But there's, I think that's what makes Great Southern really exciting at the moment. There's a lot going on, probably a lot behind the scenes, but I think in the next sort of 4 or 5 years, you'll start to see these wines pop up. And, from guys taking fruit from varietals, that go into, some interesting, pet nat type wines, right through to, dry red table wines. But, all across that gamut, I think from that, some of these things are started as a bit of fun, but all of a sudden they've gained a lot of traction and a lot of awareness, and people are starting to think, wow, I can actually do this quite seriously. And I think, and that's the excitement for me. I think, we'll start to see some incredibly good wines that probably shift people's perception of what Western Australia is about, but also what Great Southern's about. And, but not to take away from, we're very much committed to, Riesling and Syrah. We think those two varietals in their different, guises will have an incredibly strong future, and we're only just touching the surface of those varietals in our family journey. But so it's a really exciting region, and obviously up in Frankland River itself, where the region's going from strength to strength, with new plantings and new varietals, and it's exciting times.
It definitely is. And you guys, I mean, I know it's not a huge amount of wine estates in your GI, but you guys are really leading the way in that. It's hard to kind of argue with just how strong I think, Frankland Estate is in terms of its history, the people behind it who are, wonderful humans such as yourselves, but also that the strength of your brand and the wines that you put on the table year after year, incredibly consistent, but also have developed, and a bit like your undulating land, have kind of found their way into what really suits your sites. And it's just an amazing estate, and we're huge fans over on the East Coast, if you didn't know that already.
No, thank you.
I ask everybody, just to find out a little bit more about your palate, if you could only drink 3 boozy beverages for the rest of your life, what would they be and why?
I think this is one of the hardest questions that, people, whether it's friends ask me, if I was going to go and choose 3 wines, what would I buy? Or, if I could, what are you really enjoying drinking at the moment? I just find it incredibly hard because, obviously being in Frankland River, one of our big things is, you can't just duck down the road and indulge in some of the great, which is why I love travelling with our wine so much. And I've just finished 3 weeks up the East Coast, and to see how great some of those retail, small independent retailers, wine bars, the choice of wines that you now get, I just think, wow, we learn as much as, anyone when we hit the marketplace. And so to choose, 3 drinks, I mean, yeah.
Look, I won't hold you to them. And you're allowed to change your mind later.
Yeah. So, look, I'm going to sit right on the fence and probably just say, look, I mean, to go, Riesling's such a big part of it, I'd have to say one of them would have to be, a beautiful aged Riesling, probably from the Pfalz, and take your pick there. I love the power and viscosity of those wines. And I'm being very general here, but look, and then I'd probably finish with a Negroni.
Excellent, strong.
But then in the middle, look, I always take immense pleasure out of sitting around the kitchen table, and I know this is extremely old-fashioned and out of, unpopular at the moment, but some of these, to sit across the table from my father and enjoy, one of his beautiful salad Bordeaux's, I think, probably not so much about the wine as about the man, you sit across the table from. So, yeah, look, I think that, they're and they sort of pay homage to our roots a lot too with our, the story of Frankland Estate. So I know that's been very vague, but look, I think that's where we...
Look, I completely agree with you. I don't really care what's trending or what everybody else wants to drink. Sometimes it really is putting yourself in a moment with great company and looking at some of those great wines of the world where you learn so much. And yeah, so I think that Bordeaux's a wonderful area to drink from, especially when you've got some great bottle age. Man, they're life-changing wines, and I drank them with my father too. So I completely understand where you're coming from. Hunter, it has been so fantastic to talk to you. We just love what you do. The wines are absolutely superb, and it's from here to outer space for you guys. Who knows what will come next, but I hope to be along for the ride, and I really appreciate you taking some time to speak to me today. It's been a long time coming, and I'm really grateful.
It's been my pleasure, Shanteh. Thank you so much. I appreciate it, and look forward to catching up next time.
Sounds good. Cheers to you, Hunter. Thank you again. This is Over a Glass. I'm Shanteh Wale. Stay tuned for more stories from the world of wine and drinks. Listen in every Thursday on your podcast app. Follow us on Instagram @overaglasspod and contact us at overaglass@deepintheweeds.com.au.